this and stay around here. I can let that just do something. Put that underneath there. There's nobody sitting on that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
That's a good
Oh,
idea.
right over there.
This microphone I just turned on, I just wanted
Okay.
I gotta get another cell phone.
Okay, me.
Extension.
To me, test it.
Yeah, just say test.
Test, 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 testing, test, test, test. Good.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for doing it.
Good morning. The committee will come to order. Before we begin today, I would like to ask unanimous consent for our colleague, Representative David Young from Iowa, to sit on the dais and participate in today's hearings without objection. So ordered. Welcome, David. With that procedural note out of the way, welcome and thank you all for joining us this morning. We're here today to discuss a topic that is a top priority for me, for this committee, for the Secretary and his staff, and for the entire military and veteran community: the prevention of suicide among those who have served this country. Sadly, suicide is an epidemic affecting not just service members and veterans, but our nation as a whole. However, in the last year, the Department of Veterans Affairs released the most comprehensive analysis of veteran suicide data to date and found that the risk of suicide was 21% higher for veterans than it was for non-veterans. Probably the most important mission for us in this room is to ensure that the VA meets the needs of veterans actively contemplating taking their own life. The Veterans Crisis Line, VA's 24/7 suicide prevention and crisis intervention hotline for veterans, service members, and their loved ones, is a critical tool to the accomplishment of that mission. The Veterans Crisis Line is meant to be VA's first line of defense for those in the midst of life's worst moments. We cannot quantify the number of lives that have been saved since the VCL was introduced a decade ago, but we know that more than 2.6 million calls have been answered, and emergency responders have been dispatched to those in need almost 70,000 times. The demand for Veteran Crisis Line services, which now include a call option, an online chat option, and a texting message option, are growing. However, over the last year, the Veteran Crisis Line has been the subject of 3 major investigations by the VA Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office that have also found serious management, organizational, and quantitative deficiencies in virtually every facet of the VCL's operation. In February 2016, the IG found that some calls placed to the Veterans Crisis Line were sent to voicemail, and that the Veterans Crisis Line staff failed to properly monitor the quality of the services provided, and in some cases did not receive proper orientation or ongoing training. 4 months later, in June of 2016, GAO found that the VCL failed to meet its call wait time goals and neglected to monitor the quality of the text message service. 5 months later, in November 2016, Congress passed Congressman Young's legislation, the No Veterans Crisis Line Call Should Go Unanswered Act, in recognition of the findings made by the IG and GAO and the need for the Veteran Crisis Line to institute a robust quality management plan. Yet, just last month, the IG published another report which found that the Veteran Crisis Line had failed to adequately respond to a veteran caller with urgent needs, that the VA had instituted a VCL governance structure riddled with deficiencies and that failed to include clinical perspectives and input, and that the VCL was not appropriately training and overseeing certain staff. Perhaps most troubling, the IG also found that VA had failed to implement a single action plan to address the recommendations made in the IG's initial report, even though VA had agreed with all of the recommendations and committed to implementing corrective actions by no later than September. I understand that the recommendations that GAO made in the report last summer are still open. Given that, I question whether the VA is yet to fully comply with the requirements of the No Veterans Crisis Line Should Go Unanswered Act either. That is not to say the VA hadn't taken significant steps in the last year to address the VCL's shortcomings. Last year, the Veteran Crisis Line has been realigned to the Office of Member Services. The number of calls that are routed to backup call centers has been drastically decreased, and VA has stood up an additional VCL call center in Atlanta, Georgia. I believe those are positive developments, and I hope to visit the VCL in person in the coming months to see for myself. However, there is very clearly a need for more to be done, and soon, so that we can be assured that every veteran or family member who contacts the Veteran Crisis Line gets the urgent help he or she needs every single time without fail or delay. As a physician, I'm particularly upset to hear that the clinical input is not being appropriately incorporated into operations and management of the Veteran Crisis Line. A crisis line, by its very definition, is not like any other call line. For an entity like VCL, every missed opportunity can result in a tragic loss of life. According to VA's own data, 20 veterans a day die by suicide. Those stakes, those 20 lives per day, are simply too high for the Veterans Crisis Line not to perform at the highest level. VA is fortunate to have an abundance of mental health and suicide prevention experts working here in D.C. and across the country, and their knowledge and expertise should be incorporated into the Veteran Crisis Line processes and procedures at every level. I look forward to hearing this morning about how VA is going to make sure that that happens, and when all the recommendations for improvement that the IG and GAO have made over the last year are going to be fully implemented. I also look forward to hearing any and every suggestion our witnesses or my fellow committee members might have for what more we can do to improve not only the Veteran Crisis Line, but also VA's other mental health and suicide prevention programs as well. Our mission won't be over until a single service member or veteran ever feels helpless or hopeless enough to consider suicide. I appreciate our witnesses for being here to discuss this important topic with us this morning. And with that, I will yield now to my ranking member Walsh for any opening statements that he might have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Rowe, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Also, I'd like to note that this week we'll have the extension of the Choice Act, the sunset provision, and some of the changes that need to be done in that. And I want to thank the chairman for tackling a challenging subject and doing it in a manner that not only is going to get it to the floor, you're going to get it to the floor in a suspension vote, and I assume we're going to get a unanimous vote. That speaks volumes to your leadership, and I am grateful for that. I'd like to take just a minute on, I think sometimes it's important we forget this, the history of how the crisis line came about. And at this time, I'd like to thank Mr. Young from Iowa, because this crisis line runs deep through the heart of Iowa in its genesis. Back in 2007, my then colleague, Representative Leonard Boswell, himself a Vietnam War helicopter pilot, brought the story of one of his constituents forward, a young man from Iowa, Joshua Omvig, who served his country honorably, came home for Thanksgiving and took his life in his parents' basement on the evening of Thanksgiving because of PTSD. And I think it's important for all of us sitting on this panel to recognize suicide and suicide prevention isn't something new. Leonard was able to bring that to the floor, pass and sign it into law, which one of the provisions was the creation of the crisis line, one of the first acts and one of the first bills I had the privilege of working on in 2007. And so it's not surprising that there's a deep sense of ownership and a desire to make this work. And I think this committee, with an understanding that continuing to provide oversight, continuing to provide improvements and enhancements is critical. And for many of us, once you get on this committee, you start to see many of these things. There is much in place, but I think our frustration lies with implementation, and that's where I encourage all of us to stay actively engaged. I worry that sometimes we pass a piece of legislation and we watch the signing ceremony and we send that out the door to go on. And if there's any lesson I've learned here is don't send it out the door without being on top of it. Don't continue to come back. So, Chairman, I too share your concerns over the IG report on the crisis line. You said it exactly right. This is a zero-sum proposition. I know we're going to hear statistics that we improved from 31% drop calls to less than 1%. We need to look into those numbers, but again, this is the one area where we are shooting for perfection. This is beyond Six Sigma. This is every single one of those calls is life and death. Every single one of those interventions is life and death. And if it's viewed anything short of that, we're certainly failing. So I want to hear exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to figure that part out. I still believe this is one of our greatest assets. The numbers seem to support that. I do want to be very clear about this, that I am absolutely certain that the VA crisis line and those professionals that picked up and answered the phone have saved lives. It has happened. We know it has happened. And that doesn't change the fact, though, that in the progress there are there are issues. The IG's finding includes issues like this: lack of training for quality assurance supervisors, lack of clear procedures and policies, insufficient data collection and analysis, failure to oversee contracts with backup call centers, and lack of leadership and governance. These are reoccurring issues we see time and time again at the VA, and they're one of the areas and the main concern that the GAO puts the VA on the high-risk list. These have not been addressed. And the folks setting out here, and I want to be clear, another failing in my opinion, and we need to expand our definition of accountability, the director of this critical service to our veterans, the director position was left open for 10 months. So we can talk all we want about the folks down the line answering the phone, but once again, no leadership, no director, no HR function, no training, no accountability, no following the GAO. So this accountability piece that people are rightfully on extends to a much broader area. So you know the statistics. The chairman said it. I'm very interested, and I applaud Chairman Rowe has a way of asking the right questions, and in my opinion, that's what leadership is all about. What's the fix? How's it going to be done? What are the suggestions? Because what I certainly don't want to hear is someone using semantics to tell me, well, they were actually placed in a queue, not placed on hold. If you're in a crisis, life and death situation, you do not give a damn if it is on hold, in a queue, voicemail, somewhere else. You need a trained professional to pick up the phone as quickly as possible and direct you to the services to save your life. So I look forward to the testimony from folks. I appreciate you all being here. And again, I would ask my colleagues up here, our colleague from Iowa, started this in 2007. We've got another colleague from Iowa that worked to enhance upon it. And for all of us, it's our responsibility to fix this. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen, for yielding. Joining us on our first and only panel this morning is the Honorable Michael J. Massall, VA Inspector General. Kata Keeler, the Legislative Associate for the National Legislation Service for the Veterans of Foreign War of the United States. And Melissa Bryant, the Director of Political and Intergovernmental Affairs for the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and Steve Young, VA's Deputy Undersecretary for Operations and Management, who is accompanied by Matt Atudis. Did I get that right, Matt? I'm amazed I got that right. The Acting Executive Director of the Office of Member Services. Thank you all for being here this morning, and Mr. Massall will now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walls, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the OIG's recent work on the operations of the Veterans Crisis Line. The tragedy of veteran suicide is one of VA's most critical issues. The rate of suicide among veterans is significantly higher than the rate of suicide among U.S. civilian adults. VA's most recent estimate calculates that 20 veterans commit suicide a day. Of these veterans, approximately 14 have not been seen by VA. The VCL is essential to reduce veteran suicide for those who call in crisis. In our February 2016 VCL report, we identified several problems with the VCL, including crisis calls going to voicemail, a lack of a published VHA directive to guide organizational structure, quality assurance gaps, and contract problems. Our February 2016 report resulted in 7 recommendations, and VHA concurred with the findings and recommendations. VHA provided an action plan and time frame to implement those recommendations by September 30th, 2016. However, as of today, all 7 of those recommendations remain open. In June 2016, we received an allegation related to the experience of a veteran with the VCL and its backup call centers. As a result of the complaint, and in light of the open recommendations from our February 2016 report, we expanded our scope to conduct an in-depth inspection of the VCL. We also received in August 2016 a request from the Office of Special Counsel to investigate allegations regarding training and oversight deficiency with social service assistants who assist call responders. Our March 2017 VCL report made the following findings. We substantiated that VCL staff did not respond adequately to a veteran's urgent needs during multiple calls to the VCL and its backup call centers. We also identified deficiencies in the internal review of the matter by the VCL staff. In the interest of privacy, information specific to this veteran is not included in our report. However, relevant information has been provided in detail to VHA. With respect to the governance structure, operations, and quality assurance functions, we identified a number of deficiencies. Among other findings, we reported that there was a lack of effective utilization of clinical decision makers at the highest level of VCL governance, a lack of permanent leadership during much of the last few years, a failure to collect the appropriate clinical data necessary to assess performance, deficient oversight of the backup centers, lack of background and training in quality management principles, and the limited experience of supervisors in the new Atlanta call center. With respect to the allegations referred by the Office of Special Counsel, we found that the VCL lacked a process for monitoring the quality of performance by social service assistants and deficiencies in SSA training. All 23 recommendations from our 2016 and 2017 VCL reports remain open today. They fall into the categories of governance, operations, and quality assurance. Governance recommendations include the establishment of a VCL directive that guides structure, roles, and responsibilities, appropriate collaboration between clinical and administrative leadership, and lines of authority that delineate that clinical policy decisions be made by clinical leadership. Operations recommendations include information technology infrastructure improvements, a better tracking of updated policies and procedures and related staff training, and that contractors be held to the same standards as the VCL. Quality assurance recommendations include QA leadership be fully trained in QA principles, negative clinical outcomes evaluated in order to improve, quality data be used to enhance performance, call recordings be used for quality assurance, and that the performance for the Canandaigua and Atlanta call centers be analyzed separately. We recognize the difficulties and challenges in operating a crisis hotline. Our 2016 and 17 reports identified various challenges facing the VCL in their mission to provide suicide prevention and crisis intervention services to veterans, service members, and their family members. Until VHA implements fully the open 23 recommendations from our 2 reports, they will continue to have challenges meeting VCL's critically important mission. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Keeler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walls, and members of the committee, on behalf of the men and women of the VFW and our auxiliary, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present our views on the Veteran Crisis Line before the committee. In 2007, Department of Veterans Affairs Health Administration, VHA, established a suicide hotline which became what we know today as the Veteran Crisis Line, or VCL. Since then, the responders of VCL have answered more than 2.8 million phone calls, over 62,000 text messages, and have initiated emergency dispatch services more than 72,000 times. While these numbers are impressive, the VFW believes more must be done to improve the VCL. Since the GAO report released in May 2016, VA has worked to improve the VCL in many ways. These efforts have been successful in bringing the number of calls sent to backup centers drastically down. In fact, the first week of November 2016, the VCL had over 3,000 rollover calls. Now, over the first week of March, VCL only had 28 rollover calls. Yet without being able to promise every veteran it is practical for the 2 current VCL centers to answer every call, it is imperative VCL continue contracting SAMHSA-approved backup call centers. Even with the impressive drop in rollback phone calls, the VFW worries about quality of crisis intervention provided, while VA currently focuses on quantity of calls answered. While precise numbers of non-veterans and veterans not in mental health crisis who dial into VCL are unknown, it is publicly recognized call lines are sometimes clogged up by them. Last year, it was publicized 4 callers called the VCL to harass responders thousands of times. Estimates said those 4 people made up more than 4% of incoming VCL calls. Even in light of the most recent VA OIG report, veterans have self-proclaimed that they call VCL for non-crisis issues, such as to complain about a doctor or try to schedule an appointment, because it's the only VA number that they can find. For this reason, the VFW believes expanding VA's Office of Patient Advocacy would greatly benefit VCL. By improving and expanding patient advocacy offices throughout VA, employees of these offices would have better visibility and means to assist non-crisis patients. If veterans become more aware of the patient advocate mission and capabilities, non-crisis callers to VCL would decrease. The VFW urges this committee to conduct extensive oversight of the VA Patient Advocate Program to ensure veterans are able to have their non-emergent concerns answered and addressed without having to call into the VCL. Employees at VCL undergo extensive training before being able to answer crisis calls, and it takes an additional minimum of 6 months before responders are able to answer chat and text conversations. While this training is thorough, it wasn't until late December that VCL had the capability to record their calls. Staff at VHA and VCL currently monitor some calls for quality assurance, but a better constant process must be implemented. This would ensure these recordings are being used to improve the training and capabilities of VCL responders. It would also assist with ending allegations of responders not understanding or following protocol and knowing their resources. There is zero doubt clinical oversight is a necessity for VCL. Clinical decisions must be made by clinicians and not operations and administrative staff. Leadership running VCL must also have clinical background. This would ensure veterans calling VCL receive the best clinical judgment and assistance. Clear guidelines must be established for VCL so non-clinicians are not forcing a clinically based crisis line to operate as a business. VHA must also establish clinical and operational policies specific to VCL. This would allow for easier protocol standards to be understood and met on a constant basis, while establishing guidance and regulations to be followed by employees without clinicians stepping on the toes of operations or operations stepping on the toes of the clinicians. This can be done with better collaboration between VCL, VHA member services, and the Office of Suicide Prevention. If the goal of VCL is to intervene veterans in need of immediate assistance while they're in a mental health crisis, the VCL should be working with the subject matter experts in suicide prevention and outreach for VA. The VCL Clinical Advisory Board must also be more involved. Currently, the board only meets once a month for a 1-hour phone conference meeting. This group was intended to assist VHA member services and collective expertise of clinicians to improve the veteran experience, efficiencies of employees, and increase access to VCL. The board's charter was later changed by member services leadership, and the VFW thinks it's clear that a 1-hour phone call every month is not enough. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. I'm happy to answer any questions you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bryant, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walz, members of the committee. On behalf of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America and our more than 425,000 members, thank you for your time 2 weeks ago as IAVA introduced our She Who Borne the Battle campaign. We look forward to working with you and your staff to fully recognize and improve services for women veterans. We also thank you for the opportunity to share our assessment of ongoing concerns with the Veterans Crisis Line today. Mental health and suicide prevention remains one of the top concerns of our members, where 75% of respondents to our recent survey still believe troops and veterans are not getting the care they need for mental health injuries. I'm here today not only as IAVA's Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, but also as a former Army captain and a combat veteran of the Iraq War. I was a military intelligence officer, a leader of men and women in combat, and I bore witness to the trauma and anguish several of my friends and soldiers endured when dealing with suicide. While I am internally grateful that my soldiers were saved by mental health interventions, I mourn the loss of my sisters and brothers in arms who lost their battle and died by suicide. I am giving voice to all of us who served in the invisible wounds of war as I speak today. In 2007, IAVA fought for and celebrated the passage of the Joshua and Omvig Suicide Prevention Act, which among other things required the establishment of the VCL. IAVA signed an agreement with the VCL in 2012 and continues to partner with them today to ensure our vets are aware of the critical services the VCL offers, as well as to provide crisis support to clients who are seeking help from IAVA's Rapid Response Referral Program, or RIP. To date, our RIP veteran transition managers have referred nearly 200 clients to the VCL. These clients share both positive and negative stories of their experiences with the VCL. IAVA wants to get to a place where all feedback we receive about the VCL is positive. The VA has publicly addressed VCL's inability to handle call volume and its reliance upon a backup call center to field these calls, but they haven't addressed the additional findings of the IG report that point to larger, more systemic issues: the VCL's governance structure, operations, and quality assurance protocols. IAVA strongly urges the VA to reconsider its management structure of the Veterans Crisis Line. There must be a dual leadership structure in which an operations lead can oversee the functional aspects of the call line, while a clinical lead oversees the clinical aspects. These roles must be complementary and cooperative to ensure the success and safety of both clients of the VCL and the responders who are answering their calls. Finally, the Office of Suicide Prevention must be heavily engaged with the operations, quality assessment, and oversight of the VCL. IAVA implores the VA to also consider whether the level of clinical support provided to each call responder is appropriate, how the VCL is addressing self-care among responders, and what mechanisms are in place to prevent staff burnout and experienced responders from moving on. Compassion fatigue is real. Moreover, applying a sterilized quality assurance protocol that could easily be templated for determining a customer service rating for your home cable installer is woefully insufficient for our veterans. We would expect the Veterans Crisis Line would fall under the purview of two laws championed by IAVA: the Clay Hunt SAVE Act, which requires the annual evaluation of VA's mental health and suicide prevention program, and the Female Veteran Suicide Prevention Act, which goes a step further to require analysis of these programs by gender. Our She Who Born the Battle campaign is anchored in the fact that women veterans are the fastest growing population, yet often go unrecognized. We don't know how many women veterans use the VCL, nor how effective the VCL is at providing support for women, or even if they're welcomed by a responder that is answering their call. As part of our She Who Born the Battle campaign, we recognize that the motto of the VA functions as a symbolic barrier perceived by many women veterans like myself, emblematic of our lack of parity and care compared to our male counterparts. Perhaps this culture is trickling down to the VCL. A holistic program evaluation, including gender-specific data, should be conducted to know for certain. We point to IAVA's RIP program as a model for mental health case management. This high-tech, high-touch program has served over 7,800 clients to date, 20% of them women, connecting them with quality resources and benefits, many who may not have been eligible for VA care due to other than honorable discharge status. We put a strong emphasis on client follow-up, customer satisfaction at RIP. Programs like RIP complement the VCL and are valuable partners by supporting veterans and their families who are not in immediate crisis, but are at risk if these types of services are not provided. Often veterans have seen bad news stories about the VA or have had a bad experience, and they come to us instead. We're often one of the best on-ramps for veterans into VA support. I cannot stress enough the gratitude IAVA has for those who staff the VCL call lines and are there to support the hundreds of thousands of calls received per year. In our latest survey, 20% of respondents have reached out to the VCL on their own behalf, on behalf of a loved one. This is a critical, often life-saving resource for our community. 65% of our latest survey personally know a post-9/11 veteran who has attempted suicide, while 58% know a veteran who died by suicide. As one of those respondents who personally knows veterans who have either attempted or died by suicide, this issue is deeply personal to me, and one we must resolve swiftly. Thank you again for the opportunity to share IAVA's assessment of the VCL. We look forward to working with you in the VA in the months ahead to improve this essential resource. Thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Young, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Rowe, Ranking Member Walls, members of the committee, Congressman Young, my hometown congressman. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General's report on the Veterans Crisis Line. I'm accompanied today by Matthew Itutis, Acting VHA Member Services Executive Director. The primary mission of the VCL is to provide 24/7 world-class suicide prevention and crisis intervention services to veterans, service members, and their families. Any person concerned for a veteran's or military service member's safety or crisis status should call the VCL by dialing the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, 1-800-273-TALK. Press 1 to reach a VCL responder. You can also reach the VCL by texting 838-255, and a VCL responder will text you back. We also offer online chat at veteranscrisisline.net and vets.gov. Since 2007, VCL has answered nearly 2.6 million calls and dispatched emergency services to callers in crisis over 67,000 times. In 2009, Veterans Chat launched, providing an online one-to-one chat service for veterans who prefer reaching out for assistance using the internet. Since its inception, we have answered nearly 314,000 requests for chat. We added text services in November 2011, resulting in nearly 62,000 requests for text services received to date. On average, over 99% of calls on a daily basis are answered by the Canandaigua, New York, and Atlanta, Georgia call centers. Less than 1% roll over to backup centers. When a veteran calls VCL, we have two objectives. The first, to answer the call and effectively assess the risk of the caller. As I've detailed in my written testimony, since early January, we've answered over 99% of our calls without rollover. Our second objective is to provide sound crisis intervention services to our veterans. A quality management system has been implemented to monitor the effectiveness of the services provided by VCL and identify opportunities for continued improvement. As required by law, VA will submit a report containing this document outlining the quality management plan to the House and Senate committees by May 27th. We appreciate OIG's review and take their recommendations seriously. We are pleased to say we're strengthening our structure so the Veterans Crisis Line, the Office of Suicide Prevention, and the Office of Mental Health Operations are fully integrated to ensure clinical services are optimized. Care is seamless from the time the veteran reaches out to the VCL, and arrangements are made to ensure the veteran is safe and timely care and assistance is provided. We've submitted a recommendation that OIG close 6 of the 7 recommendations from the report published in February 2016, and action plans have been developed to address all of the recommendations for the March 2017 report, with the expectation that they will all be implemented by December 2017. During the time period of the second IG investigation, VCL was in the process of transitioning leadership from one organizational element to another and concurrently standing up the Atlanta call center. New responders were hired and trained over the course of 3 months, averaging 40 new responders being deployed every 2 weeks. The standard training cycle includes 3 weeks of classroom instruction and 3 weeks of preceptorship prior to being released to independent work. This training took our other VCL responders away from their regular duties. All this while performing some of the most profound and important work imaginable, addressing the needs on average of over 2,000 veterans a day and dispatching immediate assistance to 60 veterans a day who were in crisis. The OIG investigation concluded shortly prior to the tipping point of VCL consistently answering 99% of calls. Since this tipping point, we've had 43 days with no calls rolling over. Furthermore, in the past 6 months, VCL has more than doubled the capacity to ensure appropriate access to veterans. Today, the combined facilities employ 661 professionals, and VA is hiring more to handle the growing volume of calls. VCL is the strongest it has been since its inception in 2007. VCL has forwarded over 416,000 referrals to local suicide prevention coordinators on behalf of veterans to ensure continuity of care with their local VA providers. Despite all this, there's still more that we can do. We appreciate OIG's review of VCL. We are committed to strengthening our governance structure so VCL, Office of Mental Health Operations, and the Office of Suicide Prevention are fully integrated to ensure optimal clinical services. We are committed to seamless care from the time the veteran reaches out to VCL. Arrangements are made to ensure that the veteran is safe, and we ensure that the veteran receives timely care and assistance. We are also grateful that Congress provides the resources necessary to give veterans in crisis access to these necessary services. Thank you, and Mr. Itutis and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Young, and I'll now yield myself 5 minutes, and I'm going to have to go to another hearing, a markup in another committee for just a minute, so I'm going to go ahead. First of all, I think the Veterans Crisis Line does some of the most important work that is done in the VA. I think when a warrior gets home or even doesn't leave home and contemplates suicide, I was thinking about this when you all were giving your testimony about the number of patients I've seen over the years in my practice that I tried to diagnose a breast cancer or an ovarian cancer or uterine cancer, and all that I went through to save their lives and that they went through to save their lives. And that's what you do. I think the thing that worried me the most when in practice, the objective things I could see, I could go after and treat. The subjective about how I'm going to behave is very, very difficult. And that's why, as Mr. Waltz said, we have to get this as right as we can, because you really will never quantify how many people that never did something, but you may have stepped in at exactly the right time. So I'm going to just ask a couple of 3 questions and then let a discussion go forward. The question I think I first have at the end of your testimony is, why weren't all these things that the IG and GAO did a year ago? I hear exactly the same thing, Mr. Young, that was said a year ago that never happened. Why is that going to happen now?
We have submitted plans to the IG. However, they requested additional demonstration that we have sustained the improvements that we put in place. We have submitted now 386 documents just recently, just in the last few weeks, to demonstrate that compliance with their recommendations.
Okay. Well, I think things are getting better. The second thing I want to know is this is a constant turmoil in medical practice. Is Mr. Masal mentioned this debate over what the clinicians want to do and what the people who run it want to do. I think that is a huge deal, because those decisions ought to be made, many of those decisions I think should be made by medical professionals. I may be biased, but when you have the bureaucrats in there telling you what to do, when a clinician knows this is the most effective way to provide this care for people, I'd like a discussion from anyone who'd like to jump in on that, because I think that's a critical, maybe Ms. Bryant, you want to start with that.
Yes, Chairman. As I stated in both my oral and written testimony, IAVA feels very strongly that a clinician needs to be in an equitable position of leadership in managing the Veterans Crisis Line. Even within our own RIP team, we recognize that the clinical decisions are often very highly tailored, individualized for that specific case, for that veteran is in crisis. And you can't simply, I understand the call volume is a challenge. I understand it, it's hard to template an SOP in which you can at least evaluate the responder's response or handling of a call. But you have to at least try to individualize that as best as possible, and you have to do that with a clinician, not just in the loop, but is there with equal decision-making authority as the operations lead.
And then why wouldn't you, back to Mr. Young, why wouldn't you want to have that?
The Veterans Crisis Line does have a PhD-trained social worker that is the clinical lead of the Veterans Crisis Line. It is organizationally aligned right now under Member Services, but the crisis line itself is led by a PhD-trained social worker. And in fact, the entire leadership team has 140 years collectively of mental health experience that lead the Veterans Crisis Line itself.
Well, in your testimony, you said that the VCL is the strongest it's been since its inception, and do you have any metrics that you've measured to prove that?
I think that, first of all, the volume, and I know that that's not the end-all, be-all. That is only one piece of it, is the volume of calls that are being answered today, the timeliness of the calls being answered, on average within 8 seconds. The calls being answered by VA-trained staff themselves, not rolling over to backup call centers, 99.8% being answered by VA-trained staff. Since our tipping point on Friday the 13th of January was when we first hit 0 rollovers. But in addition to that, we have processes in place to evaluate the quality of the calls. We've established silent monitoring. Since the IG's recommendations, we have put in place call recording so we can go back and review the calls with the responders, ensure that they have established rapport, properly assessed the risk, follow procedures for linking people in to referrals if needed. And if there are shortcomings, to be able to pull them off and retrain and to re-educate around the proper procedures.
Okay, my time's expired. Mr. Walsh, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Captain Bryant, and I know you don't maybe have the data in front of you, what are the major negatives that you hear from people who've used this? What are their concerns with it?
Yes, Congressman. So I do actually have a few from our Rapid Response Program comments on the quality of feedback from the VCL. So on negative experiences, number one, we had one of our case managers visit the VCL within their floor, and it was worth noting that they were unable to provide referrals outside of the VA. So that seemed to be a challenge, especially when you're looking at total case management for a client who calls in. We understand that the VCL will then make appointments within the VA, and they could even track those appointments through their database. However, what if there's services that are required that go outside the scope of what the VA can provide? So that was one major drawback that we saw. Beyond that, negative experience included a representative saying, "We won't do that," and then they let the caller hang up. It's important to note that the way our partnership works with the VCL is that if a veteran in crisis calls our RIP team, we give a warm handoff to the VCL. We stay on the line. We have an entire SOP that we follow where we ensure that they are put in contact with the VCL before we hang up. And then we do follow up with that client to ensure that they've gone to their appointments or they've done whatever the regimen was recommended by the VCL. So a lot of what we're hearing on the negative side speaks to the length of the time to answer the phones. At one point, there was a call that took 16.5 minutes for the veteran transition manager to get in touch with the VCL responder. Clearly, these stats are unsat.
Okay. No, thank you. And Mr. Young, I'm going to, again, I want to keep this in perspective. This is about a decade long. Now we're at the point where recording calls. We're starting to do that. Is that frustration apparent? I mean, do you understand where we would come from? And are there best practices that were there, or is there no civilian comparison to show how we could do this best, why it took 10 years to start addressing the recent IG report?
That frustration is apparent, Congressman, absolutely. We want to, this is an evolutionary process, and I think we have made remarkable progress from 2007 to today, but there is so much more to be done, and fulfilling the OIG's recommendations are a key step in raising the bar and making the Veterans Crisis Line even better than it is today. In direct answer to your question about are there other standards out there, there are accrediting entities around crisis intervention centers. The American Association of Suicidology is who our crisis line is accredited by. In the same way, we ensure that those that we work with that do provide the rare instances of backup, that they also are accredited by those accrediting bodies. We'll be going through a reaccreditation process later this year with the American Association of Suicidology to ensure that we are meeting their standards for what a crisis line should be.
Mr. Young, in your opinion, would it lead to a lack of service? Why did we not have a director? I'm at the point now where my major #1 crisis in the VA is the ability to fill leadership positions over critical agencies. Is that a problem? I mean, did anybody say, dang, we need a director in this situation?
Yes, Congressman, filling key leadership positions has been a challenge over time. Broadly speaking, when we speak of medical center director positions in particular, we've had a significant number of vacancies across the country in those positions, and today I believe we have only 16 of those positions open, and we are rapidly working toward getting them filled. In the case of the Veterans Crisis Line, we advertised for that position. We had 3 candidates. None of whom were what we wanted in terms of the caliber to lead it. Fortunately, we had a highly talented individual who wasn't interested in the job long term that was willing to step in and help us build this program as we were building it up. He has since moved on. He, intended all along to just be there a short time. And now, again, we have an acting director for the Veterans Crisis Line, a PhD-trained social worker, and we are actively recruiting right now to fill that job again.
We need to help you with that. I'll close on this. This is not to you. This is to the folks listening right now. The press release that came out after the IG report said you had fixed the problems. I would be very careful saying you fixed the problems with the VCL. Just a suggestion. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Walls. Mr. Billirakis, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it so much. Mr. Young, among the list of actions VA is taking in response to the most recent IG report is, and I quote, ensuring all staff are educated on policies to include roles and responsibilities. My goodness, I would think so. I mean, it concerns me that an employee working for a program as critical as this one, in some instances, didn't know what his or her role was, nor was it evident that all staff was thoroughly educated on relevant policies. Again, I'm astounded by this. Why would that be the case? And how do you plan on ensuring a complete understanding of program and agency policies moving forward? Again, I mean, is this widespread? I'd like to ask the rest of the panel as well. But if you could respond, Mr. Young, and will you have similar assurance for backups call center staff as well?
Congressman, yes, it is an expectation, absolutely, that employees understand their roles and responsibilities. I think I will defer to Mr. Itutis to go ahead and give some details on that.
Sure. The goal of the Veterans Crisis Line renovation is to do exactly what the OIG recommended. And so we took the original recommendations from OIG in February of 2016 very seriously and immediately started working on canonizing processes. The timing of the second OIG investigation was within a handful of months of the ending of the first and the publishing of the first OIG recommendation. Taking an organization where there are few to no SOPs, any standing operating procedures, no formal curriculum for responder training, no formal curriculum for SSA training to make sure that our SSA staff that coordinate emergency dispatches and attempts, there was very little to nothing in regards to documentation. That takes time to do that. And the beginning of another investigation on the heels of beginning to address those things that need to be in place, while it's important to document those, we feel very confident at this point where we have documented the procedures and canonized the processes for the responders that are taking these tough calls, 2,000 a day, and making sure that our SSAs are fully trained. We've certified that training. We've canonized the processes for both of those critical functions inside the VCL.
Ms. Bryant, what do you think about that?
IAVA wants to see the VCL brought to a level to where, as I stated during my testimony, that all feedback is positive. We think that it is encouraging to hear that the VCL has taken steps in the recent months to address some of the issues, but we still believe it doesn't go far enough. We still believe that a stronger clinical program is needed. We're hearing steps in the right direction, but we want to see more. I mean, we really want to see more in the training. We really want to see more in taking care of the responders who are receiving these calls. We really want to see more in seeing that clinical lead being the, really setting the standard for how these responders not only receive calls, but then also receive care of themselves. Again, I go back to what I said during my testimony, compassion fatigue is real. We understand that a strong clinical program requires a 1 to 10 ratio of responders to clients. We want to see these types of standards applied as the VCL goes forward with its reorganization.
Thank you. Mr. Young, in the IG report, it was noted that when calls were placed in a queue at a backup call center, the line was not answered until a representative was available. There was no process to route the call from one backup center to another. Is there a process now in place?
We currently are answering 99.84% of the calls ourselves. So it is the rare instance of a call that's going to a backup call center. Yesterday, we answered 2,406 calls, and 7 went to a backup call center. So it is the rare circumstance now where we are even using the backup call center.
But is there a process in place now?
I will defer to Matt on that.
There is a process, and historically what the VCL has done, they're a part of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Network, which consists of 160 other call centers across the country. So NSPL is managed by a contractor, the Mental Health Associates of New York City. We are in current negotiations to redefine what that backup looks like now that we have actually created near 100% success for VA VCL to be able to handle that volume. Historically, what has happened prior to where we are today with the access that we have inside VCL, we had 4 of those 160 centers in the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline as part of our contract where they would take our calls. Unfortunately, the volume that we were rolling over, when you roll over 3,000 to 4,000 phone calls per week, that's problematic to other call centers that have their own core mission of providing services for their communities and for their states. And so we believe that the right thing to do was to be able to actually demonstrate to NSPL and SAMHSA and MHA NYC that we're going to take care of our own and make sure that we enter into a new generation in regards to rollovers and what that means in regards to catastrophic support.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. I have some questions, but I'll submit them for the record.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Mr. Takano, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Massal, your report highlights several concerns with VSL governance. In your opinion, should the VSL remain under member services, or should it be transferred back under the VHA Clinical Administration and Suicide Prevention Office?
I don't know if there's necessarily a right answer as to what the structure should be. We do feel very strongly that there's both member services and the clinical staff have important things to contribute to the VCL. And what we identified was that the clinical staff felt marginalized and that they weren't contributing their fair share or what they needed to do to make this as effective a crisis hotline as possible. So it's got to be a better balance of contributions from member service, from the clinical side with respect to member services.
You know, I'm troubled by knowing that about the chronology of the leadership of the VSL. Am I correct that we really haven't filled that position for the 7 years it's been in existence?
It was filled before. It was open for a period of time in the last, well, I should say it was open for a significant amount of time in the last couple of years. It was filled for a short time in 2016. The director left at that time, and I don't believe, but certainly since our review ended in December of 2016, they did not have a permanent leader in place.
Well, can Mr. Young or anyone give me an idea, just like the chronology, since we just how, one of the things I'm really troubled by with the VA is the lack of continuity of leadership at the very top, but this is not the very top. This is kind of a, you know, a program within the VA. Can you give me an idea about just the chronology of leadership?
That was actually before my time and before I had an awareness of it, but I'll defer to Matt to see if he can give us a little bit more insight.
Sure, there's always been a clinician in charge of the Veterans Crisis Line, despite the fact that the Veterans Crisis Line was realigned to member services last year. The Veterans Crisis Line has always been led by a director. Our current acting director has got 30 years of emergent psychiatric experience and is a expert in crisis management. And with 140 years collectively throughout our entire leadership team of mental health care experience.
Yeah, but I want to get some idea of just to put a director in place, I mean, to have them there for 1 or 2 years, it just doesn't seem to me enough time to establish a good program and a good vision.
So, Congressman, I'm sorry, I don't know that history, so I will have to take that for the record and bring that back to you.
Yeah, thank you, I appreciate that. Back to the Inspector General. Is VA on track to address the 23 open recommendations in your estimation?
We've been working with them with respect to the 2016 recommendations. Mr. Young pointed out they have provided us recently with a lot of documentation that we're reviewing. We would like nothing better than to close out the open recommendations as quickly as possible. I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding of exactly what our recommendations require, and we spend time talking to them to make sure they understand. And let me give you an example, which I think relates to some of the discussion on governance issues, and the fact that we identified that there wasn't a clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities. In our 2016 report and here, we said they need a VCL handbook. What we got in return was an employee handbook. And we said an employee handbook can determine, the tardiness of employees, their dress, et cetera, how an employee respond. It doesn't go to making sure people at the VCL understand their responsibilities. And that's what we're going to need to close out that recommendation. We've certainly communicated that on more than one occasion.
Does the hiring freeze affect any ability here to get the VCL really on track?
The VCL positions are exempted from.
They're exempted. Okay, thank you for letting me know. I'd appreciate, for the record later, any additional processes the VA, such as one you mentioned, should put in place to oversee the backup call center contracts. We don't have the time, but if we can get that later from my office, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, gentleman, for yielding. Now yield to Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the panel for coming here to share their testimony. I also want to say hello to you, Ms. Bryant. Her colleagues with the IAVA have been to my office several times now and have helped provide my staff with information on a variety of veterans' issues and legislation. I'm glad you could be here to share the IAVA's perspective on today's hearing. Ms. Bryant, based on your testimony, IAVA's Rapid Response Referral Program does try to address these aspects of caring for female veterans. Would you please share with us more about the RRRP and how VA might be able to replicate aspects of the program to improve the VCL?
Yes, Congresswoman. First, I'd like to point out the director of our RIP program behind me, Vadim, who is sitting directly behind. One of the things that we speak about of RIP, they specialize, again, in high-tech, high-touch, which means not only is there the warm handoff to VCL when there is a veteran actively in crisis, actively suicidal, but then we follow up, and that's really the model we would like to see the VCL replicate, is the follow-up care, to ensure that, okay, you've made an appointment for a veteran in crisis, but did they go? Was that effective? We continue follow-up not once, but a few times. It just depends on, again, individual case-by-case basis. And that's the strength of the RIP program, is that it allows for that individualized case management depending on what the needs of that veteran are. And it's not limited in scope to what the VA can provide. It also is for any other program that's available to veterans where RIP can be an advocate for that veteran and allow for everything ranging from whether it's legal services to mental health care, et cetera. Vis-a-vis our women veterans, as we know intrinsically as women veterans, that we don't always receive a welcoming greeting when we go to the VA, and by and large when we call the VCL. Unfortunately, I do not have the data on that, so I can't speak definitively to that aspect, but I can speak as a woman veteran of the experience sometimes being cold or dismissive when women are in crisis, and that's the difference between what the RIP program does versus what we're hearing in negative feedback for the VCL. I do want to also caveat there is positive feedback, and we, again, do not want to see the VCL fail. We cannot continue to have the statistic of 20 veterans a day committing suicide. Thank you.
Mr. Young, Ms. Bryant's testimony notes that we do not know how many women veterans use VCL, nor how effective VCL is at providing support for women. Do you have gender-specific caller and outcome data that you can share with us today? Does VCL track the gender of all callers? To what extent are VCL staff trained to take into account a caller's gender? And does VCL have a specific protocol for female callers? If so, please describe it.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The first thing that I'd like to just add on to the comment Ms. Bryant just made, and to share that for every intervention that occurs, every time that we dispatch somebody to intervene in a crisis situation and deliver them to care, we follow up and ensure that they did indeed get to a medical center and receive the care that they were dispatched to do. As it relates to women veterans and the Veterans Crisis Line, we do honor any request from a caller, a a woman veteran to speak to a woman responder. If we receive such a request, we will honor it. Similarly, any conversations that go into sexual trauma, we will ask the caller if they would like to speak to a person of a specific gender, and we will honor that whenever that occurs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Ms. Brownlee, you recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. I think there are probably a lot of very important committee hearings that are going on today, but I think this hearing today is by far and away the most important that we can have here on Capitol Hill. And it just, it still affects all of us, I think, very, very much that indeed, I think we're losing more life when our men and women soldiers return home than their experience on the battlefield. And we know we train our men and women very well and prepare them for the battlefield to avoid loss of life. And we've got to do equally the same in terms of preparing the men and women in these call centers to address this high level of suicide. And Captain Bryan, I want to thank you for bringing up the issues around women and women's suicide. And we know that women or veteran women are 6 times more likely to commit suicide than women in regular women and living in our communities. So, Mr. Young, we passed a bill to say that we need to look at data vis-a-vis our women veterans and to bifurcate that data so that we understand what best practices are in terms of treating our women in relationship to suicide. Can you share with us where we are with that and how we're doing?
Thank you, Congresswoman. The first thing that I would say, just to go back to the last answer that I gave, is that we do know that the percentage of callers to the Veterans Crisis Line that are women is 13% of our callers. The specific question that you're asking, I'm going to have to take that for the record and bring that back to you.
Thank you. I just believe that that's a problem in and of itself when you express data that only 13% of the women are using the call center, because I feel intuitively that there's a reason for that. There are more that need it but don't. And I think we've got to really drill down to understand that. And, which kind of makes me want to ask, what are we doing just in general outreach to veterans early on when they leave service, that they know this service is available to them, and what are we doing on a sort of an ongoing basis so that men and women know that this service is available to them? What are we doing?
VA has had a pretty aggressive effort at advertising the suicide prevention hotline, 1-800-273-TALK, press 1, to utilize the National Suicide Prevention Hotline as a pathway into the Veterans Crisis Line, as well as our texting, as well as the online chats, and putting the online chat available right on the vets.gov page so that it's available for veterans. We also have a research that occurs, and we have a mental health focused research center in the Rocky Mountains that's focused specifically on suicide. We have a center of excellence based in New York that looks specifically at the ideas of how do we convey the availability of these services, how effective are these communications that we put out about the availability of suicide prevention services and the utilization of those services. So there are efforts underway.
So if a veteran goes to see a doctor for primary care, does a provider continue to provide that information to our veterans?
Thank you, Congressman, for that reminder, because we do have suicide screens, depression screens that are a routine part of every primary care visit to try to identify veterans that may be at risk for suicide.
Thank you. And to the IG, if I may, just very, very briefly, because my time's about to run out, but it seems to me that we need to have better information. It seems as though we get sort of an annual follow-up to how things are going as opposed to sort of interim reports, because I think that we need to be really vigilant about making sure that we are adhering. I get frustrated because I hear a report from you and then I hear on the VA side, and they don't seem to add up all the time. I certainly would like to know more information as we move forward about how we are doing on this. So by the time we end at 2017, we know that everything has been adhered to and instituted. So my time has run out, but if you could follow up with me on that, I would appreciate it. I yield back.
Sure.
Thank the gentlelady for yielding. General Bergman, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Folks, having been fortunate enough to wear the cloth of our nation for 40 years, I'm honored to be among you today. And we know that all of us have had experiences where those we served with chose different means to end their lives. There is no way to even measure what an impact that has on the families and on the unit members that serve with these folks, because you're always wondering, could I have done something different? Could we have had one more conversation? I heard Captain Bryan say, I believe that, or someone said about the goal was all feedback being positive. I would suggest you all feedback needs to be relative, because the one thing that's common in all these situations is they're all different. And we hear more than when we're not talking. So anyway, Mr. Massal, your report mentioned that the VCL managers were unaware of the performance standards in the contract. If they were unaware of the standards, how were they monitoring the contractor's performance?
What we identified in our report is they were not adequately monitoring the contractor's performance. That was a recommendation we had.
So they were aware, but just monitoring of the standards.
They weren't totally aware of all the responsibilities under the contracts.
Okay. Mr. Young, I understand that the VA is working on a new contract to support the VCL, which will include the OIG's recommendations, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. How will this contract be different?
I will go ahead and defer to Matt, who is the person on the ground working that.
It's a good question, Congressman. So what we're working on, we're in current contract negotiations to make sure that the veteran experience, whether it take place in the VCL or one of the backup contract call centers, is a symmetrical veteran experience. That includes some very core competencies that we believe that the backup contract call center should demonstrate proficiency on. One is the service level, and we're asking them to abide by the same service level that we've implemented inside the Veterans Crisis Line. There's no standard in regards to the percentage of calls answered within so many seconds. We've adopted the National Emergency Number Association's service level. That's 95% of your calls being answered in 20 seconds or better. We're right there. We're just shy of 94%. We're expecting our backup contract center to be able to perform at the same rate. We're also expecting them to adopt our training that we have for our responders as well as our SSAs that coordinate our dispatches. In addition to that, we're asking them to adopt very similar key performance indicators and quality measures. We measure 21 different measures on our quality performance program. We've done over 4,000 of them since VCL come into member services. They include 8 very critical elements that assess suicidal ideation, third-party outreach, as well as assessing past suicide and current issues with the veteran. And those items are going to be included in the current contract, and we're under negotiations right now. We're also establishing some separate positions inside my compliance department to make sure that they are reviewing routinely the performance of the backup contract call centers to ensure that the veteran experience is as symmetrical as we can possibly make it between the backup contract call centers inside NSPL versus VCL.
Okay, thank you. I think I heard Mr. Young, someone mentioned about a call roll rate of 1%?
Less than one.
Less than 1%. Okay, with a call roll rate of less than 1%, is there sufficient volume to warrant this contract?
We think that it's important that we still have a means to support us if we should have failures. As an example, this morning in Canandaigua, New York, we had some problems with the phone lines. Now, we were able to roll things over, able to handle it all within our existing staff. But if that had been a larger problem, we need the mechanism to be able to have that backup. So we're working with as we're developing the contract. Our intention is to roll over actually a few more than we're rolling over right now, because we need them to be able to maintain critical mass, to maintain their competency working with veterans' crisis issues. So right now, we're at 99.84%, but we're going to deliberately roll over a few more than that so that they can maintain that competency level.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ms. Estee, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe and Ranking Member Waltz, for today's incredibly important hearing. And when Secretary Shulkin was with us a couple of weeks ago, he flagged that, as with us, this is his highest priority. It is a tragedy for the country when we lose a man or woman in uniform on the battlefield. It's a stain on our society when we lose them when they come home. And I know we're all committed in our effort to reduce those numbers and do everything we can, and I want to applaud all of your efforts, but I think we can agree not good enough, and we need to do better. So I want to thank you for your efforts in this, but recognize we need to maintain a sense of urgency about doing better for each and every one. Every one of those calls that doesn't get answered in time, and my office has had those calls directly to our office, and then have had to deal with staffers afterwards to try to deal with talking people back down. So I wanted to talk a little bit, Mr. Young, that Captain Bryan talked about and flagged the importance of supporting the responders. So I want to know, what are we doing to better support those answering these calls, both in terms of their training, respite? What are we looking to, for example, for best practices? Are we looking at the national centers, or how are we figuring out the right way to support the people on the front lines taking those calls every day?
Sure, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. This is the most profound and important work imaginable. Many years ago, I was a suicide intervention counselor at a crisis line. I know on a personal level the impact that it has working with somebody who may be horribly depressed, actively suicidal. It takes a toll on the human beings that are doing this work. One of the very first things that has been so important for us to do is to get staffed up so that we have the ability to be able to pull people off the phone so they can decompress for a while. We have wellness programs in place at both centers to be able to support our employees. I'd like to defer to Matt to give a little bit more detail on some of those very specific things that we're doing to support the employees.
Thank you. I believe that the photo of one of our responders in New York, Robert Griffo, who was photographed in regards to the recipient of the Oscar for the work done at the Veterans Crisis Line. Robert's dedication is significant, but what you see in that photograph is the grief and the burden associated with doing this work. And the first thing that we owed our Veterans Crisis Line responders, that are now up to 523 responders, where it was in the 200 range a year ago, the first thing that we owe Robert and his peers, as well as the SSAs, was to decompress the workload for them. Rolling over 3,000 phone calls meant that every single time there was a responder available, a call was going to them. And so we owed them making sure that we could internally take care of all of that volume and making sure that we had enough space between calls to allow some room between calls to allow these responders and SSA to be able to disenroll from the actual telephone system and walk away and get the help that they need, or to take some time to be able to reconstitute in between these phone calls. And so creating near 100% success was the first thing. The second thing we've done is establish a wellness coordinator at each campus, both in Atlanta, Georgia, and Canandaigua, New York. The third thing that we're doing is we're developing a program called Employee Readiness and Resiliency, because we believe that an employee, when they come to work, they should have time to be able to get ready to do this type of work. It should not be to just walk in, sit down, and start dealing with some of the toughest work that you can possibly find to do. And so we're implementing that program. We're also hiring clinicians that will be a part of a process that will be available internal to our employees at any given time, 24 hours a day, at both campuses that will support those employees. But make no mistake whatsoever. These employees know that when they have a tough call and when they need a minute to reconstitute, or when they need to be debriefed in regards to some of these tough calls, that is their call, and they know they have the opportunity to make that decision.
Well, thank you, because I think that's tremendously important. I'll follow up because I see my time is out. But on the warm handoff, that's what I'm hearing a lot. And that follow-up, we want to make sure clinicians are actually looped back in. So I'll want to follow up in writing. Thank you very much for the work you do.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding. Mr. Pollock, when you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Appreciate all the witnesses for being here today. This is incredibly important to everybody I know in this country. The wonderful thing about these hearings, Mr. Chairman, is that we're all on the same page. We have folks here that have fought for our country and given us our liberties, and now they're at very high risk, a lot of them. And when you see 20 veterans who commit suicide every day, that should be a real wake-up call for us. I don't know what the number is in the rest of our country among our fellow Americans, but I'm sure it's not as high here. So my question goes to you, Mr. Missal. Am I pronouncing your name correct, sir?
No, it's actually Missal.
Missal, Mr. Missal. Okay. When I'm reading your reports here, and when was the first time that you folks at the, let me back up a little bit. You're the IG at the VA.
Yes.
Okay, and you're appointed by the President of the United States.
Correct.
And you have complete independence at the VA.
I'm sorry?
You have complete independence at the VA.
We do, yes.
Right, so you have unfettered access to all this data and what have you, and you have subpoena power?
We do have subpoena power for documents.
Got it, okay. When was the first time that you folks found that there were problems with the crisis hotline over at the VA, roughly?
We issued a report in February of 2016 which identified a number of problems.
Okay, and how long did that,
I'm sorry?
How long had that report gone on? It was February 2016, but how far back did you?
We had looked back to 2014 for that.
Okay, so roughly, you've known there have been problems there for a couple of years, roughly.
Correct.
Okay, and you have 23 recommendations that were supposed to be fixed last September. They haven't been fixed, correct?
7 of the recommendations should have been fixed, or VA said they could fix by September of 2016. The other 16 recommendations are from our report that was just issued in March of
this year. Okay, got it. So my question to you, Mr. Missal, is that do you think it's reasonable with 20 veterans per day committing suicide that the VA has not fixed what they were supposed to fix 6 months ago?
This is why we consider this such an important program, why we give it such great attention.
Okay, good. It's not money, right? Because the budget we've talked about here, Mr. Chairman, has gone up, I think, threefold in the last 10 years or something to that effect. Okay, so it's not money. It's something at the VA. Who's responsible? Who's the head banana that's responsible for fixing these problems? Who is that person?
I think it ultimately goes up to the Secretary.
Okay. Okay, and who reporting to the Secretary is responsible for this problem? this set of problems?
There's a number of people within the VCL director all the way up to the secretary.
Okay, so I have a terrific staffer in the back room, Dennis Sakert. He can find out through the website or what have you who is specifically responsible so we can get on the phone with that person. If I want to do that, I think I have the authority to do that as a member of Congress, correct?
Sure.
Okay. None of those individuals are here today, is that correct?
I'm sorry?
Are any of those individuals in that line of chain of command here today in this room?
Mr. Itutis is in that line as well.
Great. Why haven't these problems been fixed?
Sir, we took the original recommendations from OIG very seriously.
I'm sure you did, but why haven't they been fixed?
Well, we've been working on them since we received the first OIG report last winter. And we had submitted, actually, of the original 7 recommendations, we submitted recommended closures for those 7 recommendations on 10 different occasions in June, October, and then again most recently in March. And so we do take it seriously. And again, I think the context...
I'm reclaiming my time, please. Make sure I understand this. 7 of the 23 were supposed to be fixed by September. Is that correct, Mr. Missel?
That's what they originally said, yes.
And that's what you said, correct?
The response from VA was originally that we would have those closed by September.
Okay, were you involved in that response?
No, I was not.
Okay, but someone above you, the chain of command was?
Somebody different, yes.
Who was that?
Dr. David Carroll.
Okay. How do you spell his last name?
Carroll.
Okay, that'll be easy to find his number. We can give him a call. Do you know why those 7 problems haven't been fixed yet?
Yes, I do. And so for context associated with what I had mentioned earlier, I believe that the lack of documentation, the lack of formalized and canonized processes surrounding responder work, SSA dispatches, and referrals, much of that was not in documentation. There was not much that was in documentation.
Okay, then why did you tell us it was going to be fixed in September?
Well, it's a very good question. And so taking an organization from having very little being actually documented and not having canonized curriculum.
But you have 360,000 employees at the VA. How can you not have documentation?
Well, again, we take this seriously. And
doesn't sound like you take it seriously enough, in my opinion. And we're on the same page. We want to help you. We want to help our veterans, and 20 of them are dying per day. So we want to help you do that. But I'm not quite sure I'm very satisfied with these answers, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Young, you had mentioned before, one of the frustrations that I feel, and I'm not speaking for anyone else on the committee, is that there are parts of the VA that work really, really well around the country and could be qualified as best practices, and yet the VA is not very good at identifying those programs that work and then implementing them elsewhere. So when you talked about the Center of Excellence in New York, can you just expound a little bit? Can you explain what that is and why you pointed to them as something that was effective?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. The Center of Excellence works around the issue of suicide, and they focus on doing epidemiological studies around suicide. They focus on the communication and how we are conveying the availability of suicide prevention services and how effective that communication is working in relation to getting veterans linked in to the care that they're needing.
So they do that analysis based on the program as it exists now? Or is it just general information about suicide in general? Are you talking about specifically within the VA?
Specifically in VA and specifically with the Veterans Crisis Line.
Okay, specifically about that. Were they asked to do that, or did they take that upon themselves, the center?
You know, that actually predates my coming onto the scene in this position, so I don't know its history in terms of how it was established, when it was established. I just simply know what they're doing now.
And what they're doing you think is good, and how does that get exported to the VCLs?
Well, the Center of Excellence works in partnership with the Veterans Crisis Line and evaluating the work that they do.
But how are their recommendations implemented, and are they? I mean, you have an IG who has, done a report that says these 23 things should be done, and the VA hasn't gotten around to most of them. So when you say the Center of Excellence is doing a really great job, how is that measurable?
I think that some of the things that we can turn to talk about the effectiveness of the Veterans Crisis Line, we talk about the number of calls that we're receiving, over 2,000 a day. 189 chats, 79 texts, but more importantly, 371 times just yesterday, 371 times yesterday that the Veterans Crisis Line referred veterans to suicide prevention coordinators. We have over 400 suicide prevention coordinators spread throughout the nation, and 371 times yesterday we referred veterans to them for care. And then those suicide prevention coordinators link up with the veterans and ensure that they're getting in and receiving the care that they need.
And so is there the kind of follow-up that Ms. Bryant mentioned about within the RIP? Is there that kind of follow-up?
It's part of the follow-up that Ms. Bryant referenced, but in addition to what Ms. Bryant referenced, whenever we dispatch anybody out to do a rescue, if you will, yesterday, we had 63 times that we dispatched people to rescue or to intervene in a veteran's that was either suicidal or actively in a state of crisis where they were needing care. We follow up on every single one of those and make certain that they have gotten in and gotten the care that they need.
Now, you talked before about having 3 resumes of people for the position to head up the VCL, is that right?
Say again, please.
The resumes that you were talking about that you found to be insufficient for the position of running the VCL, right?
Correct.
So it's not that as if you're not getting resumes. What qualities are you looking for to hire this person, and is there anything that we can do? Clearly, it's not a money issue. I don't think it's not a applicant issue. You're getting applicants. What are you looking for?
We had, when we stood up the Atlanta call center, had over 1,000 applicants for those responder positions. Among our responders, we have 99 that have bachelor's degrees, 377 with master's degrees, and 14 with PhDs. These are really highly qualified individuals. Our current leadership, the acting leadership in the Veterans Crisis Line has a PhD. We have 140 years collectively of mental health experience among the leadership in the Veterans Crisis Line. So I'm hopeful that this next round, as we are advertising and looking for a new leader for the Veterans Crisis Line, that we're going to have success in getting a highly qualified individual to come in and be able to lead those already very well qualified and high level responders.
It seems to me that should just be priority number 1.
Absolutely.
Given the need for that. Thank you. I yield
Thank
back.
you, gentlelady, for yielding back. Let's see, next is Ms. Gonzalez. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the ranking member for having this committee hearing, and I think this is very important. I just have a task force with veterans organizations in San Juan last Sunday, and this was one of the main issues they were asking for. So most of the questions have been answered, so I don't want to be repetitive, but I want to say that Chairman Rowe has emphasized the need to provide the best health care services to our heroes of our nation. In San Juan, we got more than 93,000 veterans that do not receive the same benefits as those that live in the mainland. So my question will be here, one, if we got enough data to identify the sex, the state, territory, or statistics about age of one of the mechanisms to those people who call to the Veterans Line. Mr. Young.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I don't have that information with me here today. I can take that for the record and bring it back to you.
So, but it's available?
We certainly have information available on the phone numbers that where the calls come from. Although with cell phones today, Who knows? My cell phone is Tampa, Florida, but that's not where I live. So it's not always an absolute where the person is calling.
Besides the area code, do we have sex data or age of those callers?
Yes, we use a customer relationship management software that's currently being replaced with an even more advanced version of CRM, and that's going to allow us to be able to build a number of different areas and sub-areas for us to be able to collect a lot of data that we can then reflect on, do the analysis, and make some additional programmatic changes based on the epidemiology associated with the analysis, and partnering with the centers of excellence that Mr. Young referred to, as well as with the Office of Suicide Prevention's expert, as well as Office of Mental Health Operations.
Can you provide the committee, or at least this Congresswoman, the data regarding those calls from the last report?
Yes, we'll take that.
Thank you. I don't know if you are aware that a group of 86 congressmen and congresswomen just sent a letter to the VA Secretary. I'm included in that, members. We are very upset and aware of the situation. Do you already correct or establish text monitoring to the system of text calls?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, we do accept texts. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, 79 texts that we dealt with yesterday. But since the advent of the texting option, which was in November of 2011, we've had over 62,000 texts that we've responded to.
But do we already correct the issue regarding who's making the monitoring or the testing of the timelines of the answering those texts, or no?
I'm sorry, could you repeat
Do
the
we
question,
already have tests about the timelines of the answering of those texts, or no? Because
Yes.
the last report just said that 4 of 14 texts were unanswered by the VA.
So we have processes in place to respond to all of the phone calls, the texts, the online chats in a timely manner. I'll defer to Matt to talk details on that.
We do have that data, and we test that system in regards to making sure that text and chat are properly working. We do the same thing with option 7 that we rolled out in 2016, where we added the option that has the language on every single major medical center in the country. We added the language, if you are having thoughts of suicide, press 7. That work comes to us. We even test that as well. And so we test all of our modalities to make sure that they're up and running. We're glad to provide that.
Do we have just 2 call centers, or do we have more than that?
We have 2 main call centers, one in Atlanta, Georgia, one in Canandaigua, and then our current backup contract call center with NSPL is out of Portland, Oregon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Mr. Peters, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to everyone for being here. And I do want to just echo that we really we appreciate your sense of urgency about this. We think this is of the highest priority, and so appreciate your spending some time with us. And I had some specific questions about the backup call center contracts, because it looked from the GAO and IG reports that there's some things missing. I want to call your attention to a program we have in San Diego. The county government and other entities have been using 211 services. So you just dial 211 on your phone, and it's a clearinghouse for benefits, emergency services, social services. One of the programs, coincidentally, it's not a VA program, it's called Courage to Call, which often receives calls from veterans or service members in crisis, and sometimes they're referred to the VA. Now, the county ties its payments directly to wait times. And I don't know if you have any objective, so if each call is not picked up by a live person within 30 seconds, the payment is diminished automatically. And then there's a referral for each call, to a warm handoff we've been talking about, to another live person at an agency where the professionals have been vetted for things like customer service and cultural sensitivity. So I understand, Mr. Utitis, is that? Itutis, backwards, Itutis. You had talked about, you'd given some pretty encouraging metrics about the background call centers, but I wasn't clear about how you enforce those.
Well, we're developing a table of penalties right now through our contract negotiations with the contractor that oversees the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And so the table of penalties that were previously non-existent in previous versions of the contract, we're going through that right now.
And I would maybe, do you think something like a a failure to answer within a certain time might be automatically tied to payments as part of the contract?
Well, we believe that they should be able to establish, based on the way that we designed the contract, that they should establish the same service level that we've implemented inside our organization, with a minor exception, and that is if and when we have a catastrophic situation where we cannot get to all of our phone calls, if any of them, that would be a different set of circumstances. However, the actual experience for the veteran when they contact the backup call center versus us should be symmetrical.
So I would just say, I would suggest to you that on the quantitative measures, like the amount of time on the phone waiting, it's great to think about tying that directly to performance, so you don't have to go through the appeals process and charge them with a penalty, and I just commend that process to you for the objective side. On the non-objective side, there's issues about how to measure the quality of the experience, and I think that's more difficult. But a lot of that has to do with training, and there is in the report there's a lot of suggestion that there's a lack of training for even the VA staff and supervisors. So we know the people answering the calls, they have very stressful jobs. The call center requires particular kinds of skills. What do you want to do to ensure a healthy work environment and retention in order to provide veterans the best service, both inside and then in the contracted services as well?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. The first thing that I would say is that our turnover rate is less than 4% right now at both of the call centers. It's slightly less in Atlanta than it is in Canandaigua, but we've got, by way of comparison to the rest of government, we have a very attractive turnover rate right now for employees. I'll defer to Matt on the details for the rest.
So anytime we have the opportunity to hire a supervisor or a senior official inside the Veterans Crisis Line, we try to take advantage of the talent that we actually have and the experience that we have inside the Veterans Crisis Line. One example of that is Julianne Mullane, who has been with the Veterans Crisis Line for years, who is now one of our senior deputies at the Canandaigua, New York campus, who has taken tens of thousands of these phone calls as a responder. And so she understands what the process is. She understands what that veteran experience should consist of in regards to the 13 non-critical elements in our quality assurance program, our 8 critical elements, and those will be symmetrical in the contract associated with the veteran experience when it comes to backup support.
Yeah, and I think that's terrific. I'm sure you have great employees, many of whom get it. It's just a question when you contract this stuff out, how do you enforce it? And maybe we could follow up and hear some more ideas. How do you force the qualitative aspects of that is not clear to me.
Sure. So the other thing that we're doing is we're setting aside several positions inside my internal controls and compliance department that will do nothing but dedicated work towards making sure that the backup contract call center is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing based on the new contract that's going to be in place by the 1st of July.
Okay. Well, thank you. My time's expired, but I do appreciate your attention to that and look forward to working with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it should be noted that prior to 2007, when VCL was initiated, veterans had a crisis hotline. It was each other. We called each other. And it's startling to me that since the government got involved, it seems like the suicide rates have increased. Mr. Young, who's responsible for hiring at VCL?
The individual responsible for hiring at the VCL would be Mr. Itutis is the Director of Member Services, and then we have an acting Director of the Veterans Crisis Line itself.
Okay. Are you aware how many veterans live in the United States? How many living veterans we have in the United States of America? It's 22 million.
I was going to say I know the number, but
according to
while sitting here,
according to the numbers that I'm reading, there are 594 employees, 23% of veterans. So is this committee to understand that out of 22 million veterans across the country, 137 are available that have the skills described as to hold a degree in the field relating to social science with a focus on social work, and mental health counseling. Is this the best we can do for our veterans, that out of 22 million from sea to shining sea, 137 of them are available to answer the phone on a crisis hotline?
No, sir, that's not the best we can do. What I would tell you is that we actually exceed 40% of our staff of being veterans. We hired as many as we possibly could. We exhausted every veteran certificate that we had in Atlanta, Georgia, when we hired those positions. The other thing I would tell you is that we're in cooperation with the Office of Mental Health Operations to establish a next generation of VCL in regards to outreach that will include peer support specialists that would have background and experience with mental health and substance abuse and those types of issues, as well as being a veteran. And so we agree with you, Congressman, that that's something that needs to be a part of the portfolio of the Veterans Crisis Line.
One would hope so. Are the veteran service organizations counseled regarding hiring? There are many VSOs across the country that are dedicated veterans themselves that generally work for free in service of their fellow veterans across the country, male and female. Does the VCL hiring process consult with VSOs in order to seek veterans that carry the qualifications that can fill these roles?
That's an area that we can work more closely with them on.
Ms. Kelleher, did I pronounce your name right, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Kelleher, as a representative of the VFW, in your opinion, in your humble opinion, ma'am, would the VCL be best able to address some of these problems that we're discussing today by filling the ranks with veterans themselves, whereby when a veteran does call seeking help, they're talking to a fellow veteran?
So in my opinion, in the VFW, we've always supported peer-to-peer support, and the expansion of it. VA's had great successes with it, and veterans who do use VA have responded with much positive feedback. VFW's been advocating for more and more expansion of that and increasing the employees at VCL who are veterans would, in my opinion, greatly benefit. But at the same time, I don't think we can ask VCL to strictly hire based off of veteran status. They need to look at the most qualified candidates and make sure that they are trained the best while expanding peer-to-peer. 22 million veterans is a lot, and I think in a dream world, we would be able to have that many filling the roles at VCL, but we can't guarantee every veteran in Canandaigua and Atlanta want that position. So long as VCL is continuing to hire effectively with a focus on veterans, and VA continues focusing on peer-to-peer, other VSOs, I know VFW has been partnering with VA. We have our mental wellness campaign. So we've partnered with VA with suicide prevention and expanding and making sure that veterans know the signs of distress, and then making sure VA has the resources available to provide those veterans.
Thank you for that answer, ma'am. That was a very thorough response. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Sablon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone. I truly apologize for not being here earlier. I have 4 things going on at the same time, but one, let me extend with welcome, but Ms. Kelleher, I want to let you know that members of your organization in the Northern Marianas, I'm from the Northern Marianas, are some of my, they're people I turn to on many issues of veterans. They're very helpful, and I appreciate them. Mr. Young or Mr. Matthew, I come from a place, sir, where today, we've been a part of the United States since 1978, but today someone would go to a post office in some rural place and try to mail something to my island, my district, and they'd be told that it's an international, and there's no post office there, or that the U.S. doesn't, it's not part of the United States. Sometimes telephone companies make mistakes, and Area code is 670. That happens to be the country code also for East Timor, so they get charged. So we're far out, and when you talk about territories, people hear about Puerto Rico and Guam. We tested the hotline. We've tested the text. It works. Now let me ask you, if a veteran would go to that hotline, place a call, how would you find someone there that would be able to provide immediate attention to a veteran who may be considering, who may be in a difficult situation and may be considering harming himself? And I'm talking about 3 separate islands here now.
Thank you, Congressman. I think that is one of our more challenging areas.
Yes, sir.
We do have suicide prevention coordinators around America, including a suicide prevention coordinator in the Pacific Islands healthcare system that is able to engage by phone and to stay in contact with veterans that may be at risk. The suicide prevention coordinators, especially in areas like you're describing, and it's elsewhere in America too. It's in some of our more rural areas as well, where they have a responsibility to know of the resources that are available locally and be able to refer people appropriately for those resources.
Yeah.
And so that is how we would approach it in that instance.
So the crisis line, if I was to place in a call, the crisis line would be able to find someone for me to talk to if I was in a precarious situation.
The crisis line regularly refers veterans out to our suicide prevention coordinators around America. And so in this instance, they would, if there was an individual that they felt was at risk in your district, they would refer to the Pacific Islands suicide prevention coordinator, and then that person then
Where's that?
That's in Hawaii, which obviously is a long ways away, but it's the same circumstance that we have, as I said, in other parts of the nation.
Yes.
In terms of being familiar with local resources and being able to connect those veterans, utilizing telehealth technologies and other mechanisms to stay connected with them. So it is less than ideal, but it is a mecanism.
It's very wanting. It's not less than ideal as a perspective. And I understand that we're so removed, and but I appreciate what you guys do. Hopefully we could work something together where there's a more personal response. I mean, my God, thinking of trying to end my life is a serious situation, but thank you very much for what you guys do, and again to the veterans of foreign wars, please know my gratitude for your members. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ayuba.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Dr. Winstrup, be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you all for being here today and addressing this very challenging situation. And I'm going to address this to you, Mr. Young. I know that to the caller, every call is a situation is a crisis to them. I'm curious if there's tracking of the numbers of types of calls that you're getting. For example, non-crisis type calls, whether they're harassment calls or true crisis. Like I said, it's probably a crisis to whoever's calling, but do you categorize them? That's one of my questions. And I mean, do we define crisis for our veterans? Do they understand what crisis means? Are we defining it for them? Or do we need a helpline, for example? I mean, our offices are helplines, believe me. We get the harassment calls, we get people that are in need of help and guidance and direction, and that may be something that we need to expand on. Are we triaging the type of calls that we're getting? I guess my question is, are we really achieving the intent of the hotline vis-a-vis crisis, if you will?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that the very fact that we have just since January done 4,600 interventions where we have dispatched people out to rescue, if you will. That's probably not the right term, but to intervene in individuals that are experiencing a crisis to such a degree that the responder thought it necessary to engage local responders, local EMS, to reach out to that veteran and bring them into health care 4,600 times just since the beginning of this calendar year. I think that says something very serious about the seriousness of the calls that we receive. In addition to that, over 25,000 times since the beginning of the year, we have referred out to suicide prevention coordinators out across the country. Again, speaking to the seriousness of the calls that are coming in. Do we get some calls that are people harassing? Yeah. Do we get some that they're asking for information? Yeah. But the majority of the calls are those very serious, profound, important work that happens every day.
So it's not an overwhelming amount of having to really readdress where they need to be calling?
I would agree with the VFW's comments earlier that we do need to redirect people to our patient advocates and be able to work with that mechanism that's already in place to try to reduce those calls that are really unnecessary to go to a crisis line so that they were able to focus on true crises.
Okay. I appreciate that. Thanks for the feedback, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Mr. Young, thank you. You've been very patient. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Walz, and my colleagues and members of the panel here today. Thank you for your commitment to our veterans. Undersecretary Young, the Veterans Crisis Line Handbook, what is the status of that?
If you're referring to the directive on the Veterans Crisis Line, it is in draft. It's going through concurrence.
How long has it been being worked on?
We have, well, I've been in the job for 3 months. It's been in the works since I've been officially in the job. I know that much.
Are you working with veteran service organizations on that? I mean, are you opening up that process and taking input from other from veterans groups out there regarding this, and maybe the American Association of Suicidology and those kind of folks?
Well, we certainly work with in the Veterans Crisis Line, which is accredited by the American Association of Suicidology, and work to be in compliance with their standards. So our directive absolutely will be in alignment with the requirements to be accredited by an outside entity.
When were you accredited by the AAS?
I'm going to defer to Matt on that. That's before my time.
I believe that was in 2012 was the last date of our accreditation. It goes for 5 years. We're in the
It goes for 5 years. Okay, so you're up here this year.
December.
Okay, so it's not a one-time process. It's once every 5 years. Do they accredit the whole program? Do they go and credit call? Do they visit the call centers, backup call centers? How is the accreditation done?
So individual call centers are accredited. So inside the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, what I've learned from our partnership with NSPL is that individual call centers can be accredited, I think, through 7 different bodies of accreditation. We've chosen to remain with the American Association of Suicidology.
I want to talk about silent monitoring, and you're increasing the frequency of that use?
Well, going back a year, there was no silent monitoring. There was no quality assurance program.
What percentage of the calls now do you think are
I can
monitored
get you the
silently?
percentage on that, but what I will tell you is in a year, we have reviewed 4,178 calls.
What are you doing with the information, and do you find it effective?
We find it very effective. In fact, there's not a better way for us to be able to determine the success of a phone call in regards to establishing both non-critical and critical elements inside that veteran experience.
Thank you. Ms. Bryant, you have strong feelings about organizational structure and making sure that clinicians, there need to be a stronger role there. How can they work together? How do you envision that?
Well, we envision the clinicians being first of all, a part of the leadership team, and it should be an operations management and a clinical lead that work in tandem to establish protocols. And we would love to provide feedback if asked by the VA in order to demonstrate how we think that those best practices could be employed.
You said if asked by the VA. Now
Well, that would imply.
I hope the VA will ask.
We do regularly consult with, and then they do call us for our best practices.
Good, good.
And so we are in close conversation with the VA. We could do more. And so we're happy to offer our services in doing that and in helping to provide that evaluation. But again, we strongly believe that there's a robust way in which you can silently monitor calls, in which you could review calls, but then also manage the quality management and clinical review as a part of that expansion of the current protocol. It just simply does not go far enough. And so what we envision is more of that clinical lead and that clinical aspect, that individualized care being established into best practices that would need to go into that handbook.
You mentioned something in your testimony that struck me. You mentioned compassion fatigue. Those the veterans would call, those on the other end of the line, the stories they hear. Tell me about compassion fatigue, and is it real? And then how do you deal with that? How would the VA, the VCL, deal with that?
I'm going to go ahead and defer to Matt for that.
Again, that compassion fatigue, one of the first things we knew we needed to do was to establish the access. That simply meant hiring more qualified responders and SSAs. We've got an SSA, which is one of our employees. It is the specialty inside the Veterans Crisis Line that's responsible for coordinating emergency dispatches for intervention for those veterans that are at the highest risk of suicide, to include having a plan and ready to carry that plan out. And so one of the first things that we knew that we needed to do was to establish the capacity to be able to diffuse the amount of the workload. And so, as I mentioned earlier to the previous congressman in that discussion, we addressed that. We're now at near 100% access, and establishing that employee readiness and resilience program is important, adding those additional clinicians inside the organization so that we have those on board 24/7, 365. And again, make no mistake, any employee involved in Veterans Crisis Line experiences, they have the option and they are in charge of making sure that they take the time out in addition to the resources that exist inside VCL. And so they've got the opportunity to do that anytime they want.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I beg for maybe another minute or two. Thank you, thank you. Ms. Bryant, you talk about the importance of data and how can it help decrease in the end veteran suicides by looking at that data, then driving it backwards to its impetus?
Right. Well, we believe that the Veterans Crisis Line should fall under the purview of the Clay Hunt Save Act, as well as the Female Veterans Suicide Prevention Act. We asked for data reporting mechanisms just for that very reason, Congressman, to allow for us to utilize that data and figure out what we call in the Army TTPs, our techniques, tactics, and procedures that are our best practices for evaluating calls, for providing the highest standard of care. But we need the data to see that. I mentioned women veterans. I mentioned the fact that while 13% of your calls may be from women, that's all we know. We don't know anything beyond that, and we certainly don't know an evaluation of those women veterans of their experience during those calls. We would like to see that data recorded.
Undersecretary Young, I hope that you hear her and the others who are calling for some great data mining on this. Ms. Kelleher, how is the VA doing with the VCL in your assessment of connecting veterans with these emotional war wounds, these battle scars, to the local level where they can get some real help right at home?
VFW believes that overall VCL has done great with improving, particularly after the report last year, and since their launching of the ATL VCL, the Atlanta one. And the resources, we firmly believe that the majority of responders do know, but unfortunately, if even one doesn't know the resources available locally or the proper protocol, just like anything, it brings the whole thing down. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So we do believe that with the monitoring capabilities that they do have now, that will help hold those individuals more accountable, as well as show just how many people are not aware fully of the local resources. But we do believe that they're overall doing much better and improving.
Then just a final question. Ms. Bryan, you mentioned in your testimony about the invisible war, wounds of war, and these emotional battle scars. It's one thing when the military leaves the Department of Defense and leaves their service, and they're told about their benefits and services available to them, and presumably the Veterans Crisis Line that could be available to them. I'm wondering if, going back even further than that, upon leaving the Department of Defense, is there any kind of emotional or mental review or debriefing or checkup that the Department of Defense gives those who are leaving? And if not, should there be?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. It's definitely something that can be improved upon. A lot of the time, when we talk about veterans issues as a whole, we recognize that things should happen, quote unquote, left of the bank. Things should happen while you're still in uniform, transitioning from DOD or under the purview of DOD. And you have that continuity of care as you move forward to the VA. You have Military One Source, you have other mental health services that are provided while you're still in uniform, and that's usually reported through reporting procedures through your chain of command, and sometimes you don't have to even go through them to dial Military One Source. So that would be, well, I understand the DOD's answer to giving that veteran care. But then you also have the transition and you have the evaluation that you go through at the time when you first separate from the military. I can speak to my own experiences when I separated from the military, to where I went through my physical evaluation at the VA. Yes, there was a screening for mental health, but this was also 2009 when I separated, and I will say that it was nowhere near what is probably provided today, and it was probably insufficient for what I received when I separated from military service. We would love to see a robust battle handoff from the uniform to when you come home.
Well, thank you for that. And I want to thank all of you for coming here today and your love and care for our veterans and your wanting to make the VCL strong. And I want to thank our chairman and ranking member for allowing me to be here today, and you're pressing on this issue to make sure we get it right, all of us.
Thank you. We now know what an Iowa minute is, don't we?
I spent a lifetime in Iowa one day.
Come on back.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And thank you, all of you all, for being here today. I think you can see by the participation in today's hearing how important it is to this committee that this work and work right. I mean, you wouldn't have seen this kind of questioning and members who were on a lot of different committees taking time to be here. And I guess the final thing I would like to do is just to yield to Mr. Walz, see if he has any closing comments.
Yeah, just a moment. And I would thank the ranking or the chairman and behalf of all of us. Mr. Young, thank you. You're carrying on a legacy that did begin with Mr. Boswell, and I'm appreciative. All of you, thank you. I am incredibly hopeful. Mr. Atuitis, your professionalism and passion gives me great reason to be hopeful. I appreciate that. I would just close with those two most important groups that we're talking about here. To any of those veterans in crisis listening, this nation loves you. We're here to help. There is a better day. Make that call. Talk to the family. Do what needs to be done, because all of us want to get that right. And to those employees out there picking up the phone, the same thing. I don't want them to take anything away from this other than we are eternally grateful for them. We need to give them the training, the tools, everything necessary, and the leadership for them to do what they're doing, and that's saving lives. So thank you for that, and I appreciate the time. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and once again, the folks out there in the trenches are the ones that our hats are off to, that are answering the phone right now as we speak. While we're talking, they actually are intervening with somebody who perhaps is saving a life, and I want to thank them for that. We want to be sure that they have the resources they need to do their job. And I guess one of the final things I want to leave on the table is that about a year ago, we were told that VA was going to have all these manuals and have all these recommendations carried out. Nothing happened. And nothing happened adversely to anybody. And so what I would want to see you do is, are we going to have that policy manual by the end of the year so people will know that's very important for people to have that come on the job, to know what are my responsibilities, what kind of resources that we need for this job, and I think we need to know that. And if the IG report and the GAO report, since you agree to it and don't carry it out, then something ought to happen to somebody. If again, nothing happens. So I hope by the end of this year we can have a follow-up that says this has been done and somebody's been held responsible for getting this done. It does sound like things are improving, but remember, 500,000, all those numbers are just numbers. It's an individual that really matters, that one person that picks up the phone at 10 o'clock tonight, desperate, and make sure that we have a human being on the other end who's empathetic to their problem and can get their needs met. That's the whole purpose of this meeting. I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, and without objection, so ordered. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman. Appreciate it. Yeah, good stuff.